Good morning. I hope all of you know that this is the last morning of these Tuesday mornings. And on April 28th, Tuesday night, we will start a new series at the Hawaiian Village Hotel in the Carousel Room, 8 p.m. every Tuesday night. Open, of course, to the public, to you, to your relatives, your friends, anyone who has any interest in hearing about the message of the infinite way. The Honolulu bookstores will have a table of books available, for they are carrying all of our writings. On Sunday evening, Tuesday evening series will go through until June 30th. And then on Sunday evening, July 5th, there will be a public lecture there. And beginning Monday night, July 6th, there will be a closed class. So we ought to have lots of enjoyment with students coming from the mainland and a few other places as well. All of this you'll have in your notice in the May letter. Please, if there are those who are not here today that you are acquainted with, please let them know that there will be no more Tuesday mornings here. Now, before we get into this program this morning, let me answer a few questions that have been coming in on which I've made notes. And they have to do with things that come up usually with the younger students. They concern the subject of eating meat, smoking, drinking. On these subjects, I've said over and over and over that we evolve in consciousness through our studies and our meditations. In most cases, meat eating decreases as we learn more and more about proper eating. And that takes care of itself. Usually this same thing applies to smoking and drinking. I don't have to tell any of you that neither smoking nor drinking play any part in the life of a mystic or anyone on the mystical path. And therefore, they are indulged as a sufferer to be so now, but without anyone fooling themselves. At least I hope they don't fool themselves into believing that these things have any legitimate place in a spiritual study. If there were such a thing as an organization, our rule would be just as strict as the Christian Science rule. No one would be considered eligible for any membership who hadn't at least demonstrated that they had advanced that far on the spiritual path as to have overcome any feeling that their friends require them to drink or that smoking is a necessity. Smoking is a necessity. At some part of an individual's experience, but certainly not on the spiritual path. The next question, and remember that nobody is to be judged, criticized, or condemned But neither is anybody to fool themselves as to the degree of their spiritual development. Always let us be honest with ourselves. The next question is dental work. Believe it or not, I have had letters from people saying that they've lost fillings in their teeth and they'd rather not go to the dentist. Won't I fill them for them spiritually? Now you understand that when a person has developed to a certain state of consciousness, or if children are brought up in a spiritual teaching, there probably would be no need for dental work. Too many of us have come to the need for dental work before we attain any such consciousness and are just full of dental work. And it is true that as we develop spiritually, there is less and less of dental work needed. And it is even true that many times cavities have been spiritually filled. I've witnessed it dozens of times in my work. But I wouldn't like to be called upon just to sit down and fill somebody's teeth as a part of a spiritual ministry. Now the same thing applies to weight. There isn't a week goes by that I don't have letters asking me to please take up work to reduce somebody's weight. Oh, I know that's a pleasant way of getting rid of it and an inexpensive way probably. But that's not part of our function. I don't know that there is such a thing as a normal weight for anyone in the spiritual picture. But I do know this, that the control has to come from the development of our spiritual consciousness, not from metaphysical treatments by a practitioner. In other words, it comes back to the same old story, the states and stages of consciousness and the degree of our unfoldment. We are going into a new phase of our development in the infinite way. Let us approach it from another standpoint. There are three approaches to life: the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. In the physical and in the mental, we're dealing entirely with our human knowledge, our human awareness, and our human development. But when we get to the spiritual, we are dealing with a fourth dimensional consciousness which a human being never knows. And most human beings do not know that it even exists, that there is such a thing. And many human beings, more especially on the college professor level, deny that there is such a thing. But there is. There is a fourth dimensional consciousness. There is a fourth dimension of life. There is that which is called that mind which was also in Christ Jesus. If you watch Moses in his life, follow his experience as it is given from his birth, you will see that he was just a human being like the rest of us, responded to the things that we respond to, both on the good and the evil side, until one particular experience, which is called his experience on the Mount, in which he is transfigured, in which he receives illumination, in which he realizes, I am that I am that I've been hearing about and reading about. I am that. It is an experience, it is a transition in consciousness from the third dimensional consciousness in which there is a man and a God to that divine state of consciousness in which he realizes, I am that. Now, if you follow his life, you will see that from that moment on, he was a different man. In fact, there is no further trace of his human selfhood or indulgences. Everything concerns his ministry or his mission. And in a miraculous way, he goes from being a shepherd to being a religious leader. And with transcendental powers, he leads the Hebrews from their slavery in Egypt to their freedom in the Holy Lands. At every step of his journey after his illumination, there is a power that is not human that accompanies him. There is a transcendental presence or power in his experience, something that he understands by the name of I. And it brings manna from the sky. It divides the Red Sea. He doesn't. It does. In the experience of every one of the Hebrew leaders in the New Testament, Elijah, Elisha, King Solomon, Isaiah, all the way through, you will find that the Spirit of the Lord God touched them at a certain point in their development, and from that moment on, they were spiritually led. And their lives attest the fact that there is a miraculous, super-miraculous power or being accompanying them every step of the journey, enabling them to perform the mighty works which are credited to them in Scripture. Each one of those would have said what Jesus said later, I can of my own self do nothing. This that overshadows me, this that permeates my being, whether you call it I, whether you call it Messiah, whether you call it the Father within, whether you call it Jehovah, whatever name you give to it, that it is that performs these mighty works, and I am but the instrument through which it operates. And the reason I am the instrument is because of that transcendental experience in which I passed from the third dimensional human being to the fourth dimensional consciousness, and thereby became a transparency through which it could operate. Therefore, each of these would say to you, He performeth that which is given me to do. He that is within me is greater than he that is in the world. I and my Father are one, but the Father is greater than I. Note this same humility, if we may use that word, that is expressed by everyone who attains that fourth dimensional consciousness and realizes that because of that attainment they are now the transparency as which or through which this divine something operates. Now, the message of the infinite way is revealed in two parts. One is called the metaphysical part of the teaching, and the other the mystical. The metaphysical has to do with the presentation of the correct letter of truth. The mystical has to do with the attainment of that mind which was also in Christ Jesus, or that fourth dimensional consciousness which has been the consciousness of everyone in religious literature who has stood out as revelator or leader. It all has its beginning, perhaps, in the word or name or title, Krishna, Krishna. Krishna is not a man. It's the fourth dimensional consciousness which later is known by other names. But evidently, Krishna, or this fourth dimensional consciousness, appeared on earth as a man, and through that individual, spiritual truth, absolute truth, was introduced into human consciousness. Because there were no manuscripts or writings in those days, much of those original teachings are lost, but about 500, 550 BC, a man named Gotama attains enlightenment and becomes Gotama the Buddha. Buddha is perhaps the same consciousness as Krishna. In other words, it is enlightened consciousness, appearing as and through a man on earth. Now, up to the moment of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, Gotama is like Moses, just another man, just another truth seeker. Only not quite just another, because he had what it takes to stick to it for 21 years and go through all forms of teachings, all forms of asceticism, all forms of tortures practically, until after these 21 difficult years, he finds himself ready for the experience and attains Buddhahood, or enlightened consciousness. And there again, these spiritual wisdoms are given to the world, repeated again, and lost. We have in Jesus Christ a Hebrew rabbi, but we also must have some particular moment of enlightenment when Jesus the rabbi becomes Jesus the Messiah. Now, Messiah is the Hebrew word for Krishna or Buddha. It means Savior or enlightened one, or enlightened consciousness. So Messiah isn't a man. Messiah is a state of attained spiritual consciousness or fourth dimensional consciousness. And now we have this consciousness appearing as the man Jesus, and so we have Jesus the Christ. For Christ is but the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. So whether you call it Krishna, Buddha, Messiah, or Christ, you are talking about the fourth dimensional consciousness. You are talking about spiritual enlightenment. And you notice that in each case, the individual is transformed. And through that individual, a message comes of transcendental nature, of spiritual vision, totally unlike any orthodox religious teaching. Now, the attainment of that enlightened consciousness lifts one above words or thoughts. It lifts one above the mental argument. It lifts one above knowledge into a place where there is no knowledge. There is only a state of being. Now, my own experience showed me that even where there is an inner hunger, thirst, desire for spiritual wisdom, it isn't to be attained except through the original steps of knowledge and study and the letter of truth. In other words, those 21 years of Gotama's wanderings resulted in a knowledge of truth, which at the moment of illumination became the spirit of truth. Certainly, what we know of the life of Jesus, well, of course we know from Scripture of his life as a Hebrew rabbi, which means he must have studied the law, he must have studied everything that's taught in the Hebrew seminaries, he must have studied years and years and years, because they do not ordain anyone until the age of 30. You can imagine the years that he must have studied knowledge, the letter of truth, the law. And he said later that he had not come to do away with the law or the prophets. But certainly at some period in his development, he himself rose above the law and rose above that knowledge into an actual consciousness, fourth dimensional or Christ consciousness. Yet he continued to teach the letter. You have it in the Sermon on the Mount. You have it every time that he addressed a multitude, or every time he addressed his disciples. You have him teaching the letter of truth. So it was my experience that regardless of this inner hunger which all of us have who stick to a message of this type, we will not attain it just by sitting around waiting for lightning to strike us. There is a work to be done, and that work is through study and, as I discovered in my experience, another step beyond study, and that is meditation. Now, meditation has always been known, but more to the Orientals than to the Occidentals. And the subject of meditation enters very, very little into any Occidental teaching. And at the time I'm speaking of, 1930, even less than now. For when I began to look up literature on it, all I could find in any of the libraries in Boston or New York was one tiny little pamphlet, the only writing that was available in Occidental literature on the subject of meditation. It was not taught as an important thing. It was something that a few heard about, incidental to teachings. But my own experience showed me that meditation was an important step on our journey. And I began in 1932 to teach meditation, and I've been teaching it ever since, not as incidental to my work, but as a major, if not the major, part of the work. I don't believe that meditation will succeed where there isn't a knowledge of the letter of truth. I've watched many people try to learn meditation. I've watched in foreign countries thousands of students try to learn it and fail because they had no knowledge of the letter of truth and nothing to anchor to when they were engaging in meditation. And out of that evolved what I have called contemplative meditation, which is a step before the actual realization and demonstration of meditation. Now, paralleling all of this is our experience in the healing work. When an individual receives a measure of spiritual light, they do not need to know truth to do healing work. And there are some people who have received a spiritual light and become healers without ever knowing any truth. That was my experience. I was healing a long time before I knew anything about truth. But that happens only to few people, comparatively speaking. With most people, it is a matter of learning the truth first, and through the study and practice of truth, developing the healing consciousness. Now, there is a story of a woman in Christian Science that illustrates this point very well, a Mrs. Seal. She was ill and went to a Christian Science teacher for healing, and in a few days was healed. And then her teacher said, I have a work for you to do. You're to go to Germany and start the Christian Science movement in Germany. Up to that time, there wasn't a single Christian Scientist in Germany. And this woman says, well, how can I do that? I don't know German and I don't know Christian Science. I haven't even read the textbook. Oh, this one said, that has nothing to do with you. You'll heal anyhow. And that woman left the next Saturday for Germany. And she read the Christian Science textbook on the steamer on the way over. She became so successful that within 2 years she established the 3 first churches in Germany and performed such mighty healing works over there that her name and fame spread throughout the land. And then she came home for a brief visit, and her teacher recommended her to Mrs. Eddy for instruction as a teacher. And Mrs. Eddy wrote back and said that I notice on the application that this student has only studied 2 years, and that isn't enough to become a teacher. The rules say that you must study 3 years. And this teacher wrote back the history of Mrs. Seal, and then Mrs. Eddy said, send her on. For such, there are no rules. And of course, when the Spirit of God touches you, there are no rules. There's no such thing as time, and there's no such thing as a message of truth. There's just that Spirit, and it performs its functions through an individual, though the individual may not know how. Now, as I began to have patients who wanted to know how it was done, I found that I had no way of imparting it to them, because I myself didn't know. I found myself one time with a school teacher who had witnessed 2 very fine healings in her home, and came to me to find out how they were done, and she came to me every Saturday for teaching. After a few Saturdays I realized what a terrible thing I was doing, trying to teach her when I didn't know what I was trying to teach. Then I sat down and prayed about it, and I received 7 Bible passages. I wrote them down and said, oh, that's what I must teach this school teacher. And the next day the thought came, well, how can you teach 7 Bible passages to anyone? Might just well give them and let them study them for themselves, then you have nothing to teach. But immediately it came, no, that's not the answer. And then through meditation, something came to me on each one of these Bible passages, and that is our little pamphlet, The 7 Steps. Now, that is the very first manuscript of the Infinite Way message. But it constitutes the first of the letter of truth. It was the first time I'd ever seen in writing something that pertained to truth, that could be said to be orderly or systematic. Then, after that, I realized that with every subject that came up, there had to be some specific truth to impart. And so, when I was working with businessmen on the subject of business, another manuscript evolved, which we now have as Business and Salesmanship. So on. Now, in time, over a period of time, different principles stood out to me as being a part of the knowledge necessary in spiritual living and in spiritual healing. And while I was in Christian Science, these were written down in Christian Science language and with Christian Science quotations, and they appear as the book The Letters. But again, The Letters is only the truth, the letter of truth as it applies to a specific way of living and healing. But the letters won't heal anybody of anything. The letters won't supply a way of life. They merely give us the principles on which we can build a consciousness. And so it was that in 1945, when the voice said to me that next year will be your year of transition, and it turned out that way, in 1956, the daily experiences began, which resulted in the book The Infinite Way. 46, yes. No, 1946. 1946, the experiences began which resulted in the book The Infinite Way. Now, The Infinite Way is the letter of truth as it concerns the message of the Infinite Way. And all that it will do is to give us the foundation that we can take into our consciousness and upon which we can build a consciousness of truth. Therefore, the metaphysics of this message is included in its literature. It is the letter of truth that is found in every pamphlet, every book, and every monthly letter. But when we have these, we have to do what you've got to do with the Bible. You have to take them into your consciousness, live with them, learn how to practice them in daily living, and then learn to contemplate them in an inner silence. This leads to the step of meditation. Now, the study and the practice of the principles and contemplative meditation are all the first part of our work, and we will call that the metaphysics of our work, or the correct letter of truth. Then comes the period in which you enter the mystical side of this message, which is the actual conscious union with God, or actual consciousness of truth. And the consciousness of truth has nothing to do with the letter. It is arising above the letter. It is to where you feel and know something but couldn't say it, couldn't speak it, couldn't even think it. You can only experience it. Now, we cannot demonstrate the mysticism of the Infinite Way without having demonstrated the letter, except in those rare cases where one is touched by the Spirit of God and wipes out the need for the letter. Well, when this Spirit touches an individual, as it did Moses or any of the Hebrew prophets or the Oriental saints and seers, when it touches any individual, this higher consciousness becomes a law of harmony to those who are led to that state of consciousness. In other words, the Hebrew people benefited by being in the experience of Moses. Moses' enlightenment brought the Hebrew people into their freedom. They didn't attain that consciousness themselves. That's why they couldn't maintain their freedom. They came into it on the coattails of Moses and his attainment. But during the period of Moses' teaching, enough Hebrews did come into the consciousness so that even though the Hebrews would fall by the wayside many times, another leader was always ready to pick them up again and carry them another step forward. In other words, Moses not merely brought the Hebrews through under his grace, but he provided them with teachers and spiritually endowed men to continue carrying them forward, even though there should be many falling by the wayside. In the same way, you watch Jesus, and you will find to what an extent he lifted his disciples above being fishermen and tax collectors, so that by his grace they attained a certain measure of that consciousness. So did the apostles, the 12, the 70, the 200. Each of these attained some measure of enlightenment through his enlightenment. If I be lifted up, shall draw all men unto me. Now, not all of the followers of Jesus Christ attained enlightenment, but they all profited by his enlightenment. And not all of the disciples and apostles and 200 were able to keep all that the Master gave them. Certainly we know that Judas didn't, and Peter didn't, and Thomas didn't. But in every case, they were further along than they would have been without the Master. Now, multitudes benefited during the days of Jesus Christ by his attainment of Christ consciousness, even though only dozens may have actually entered into some measure of the consciousness into which he entered. But enough were lifted up so that for 300 years after the Master left the scene, his work was carried on. Christ consciousness remained on earth doing healing work. In fact, even up unto 600, there was work of healing and of spiritual regeneration and of spiritual living. So we come to this period where something touched my consciousness that resulted in this infinite way work and has brought forth a literature that gives us the correct letter of truth to the degree that already it is evident how many are doing healing work and being healed through it, even without coming into the fullness of the spiritual consciousness. Just the practice of the correct letter, the practice of the first stages of meditation are already bringing into the world sufficient fruitage that this message has gone around the world, at least around the Protestant world. Now, in these past few weeks, another step has been taken in that whatever this spirit is, this consciousness, this fourth dimensional consciousness that has governed and influenced my own life to this extent, has broadened its activity, or else has been given greater opportunity for expression, in that this consciousness is becoming your consciousness. This fourth dimensional consciousness, which has been operating as my consciousness, is beginning to operate as your consciousness. That does not necessarily mean every individual who's hearing my voice or who will hear this tape, but it does mean that within the realm of those who are working and studying in the infinite way, some measure of this fourth dimensional consciousness is becoming your consciousness, for I see its fruitage. I see it in every part of the world where we function, that things are taking place beyond the capacity of the individuals through whom they're taking place. In the same way that for these past 29 years I have witnessed things in my personal life taking place far beyond any capacity that I as an individual have ever had. I know that something greater than myself has functioned my life these 29 years. I know that the miracles that I've witnessed in healing and in the going forth of the infinite way and in its financing and its prospering and its healing work, I know that that's a transcendental consciousness that's greater than I could ever be. I know that much more so than you do. But now I'm witnessing how this same consciousness is operating in the experience of some of our students and producing works through them greater than their capacity. Therefore, it is no longer they that are doing it, but this same fourth dimensional consciousness that has been working down through the ages and is working with us in this age. Now, you are witnessing, even though you do not yet know it, a transitional experience in all of human history. You are witnessing something that Mrs. Eddy said she hoped that she would witness and never did. She said she hoped that this spiritual healing would be accepted by the already existing churches. Thereby making it unnecessary to found another church. But as you know, it was rejected by every church on the face of the earth in her day. But this you have not yet fully seen, as I do, sitting at my desk. The churches of the world are accepting spiritual healing. They are accepting meditation as a practice. They're not accepting it through Christian Science because the Christian Science has evolved a church and a book which has to be accepted. It is accepting it partly through the infinite way, through other avenues of its own. But the infinite way is being accepted in the Protestant church and its writings. Even in Sunday school classes, they're teaching from the two books, The Art of Meditation and Practicing the Presence, having courses in them, in churches and in Sunday schools. So that you are witnessing, and mark this, not the growth of the infinite way. That's of no importance. That's only incidental. You are witnessing the acceptance into human consciousness at all religious levels, spiritual living, spiritual healing, and the use of spiritual power in daily affairs. You understand that this means eventually that people will be using spiritual power in their business life, their home life, and their political life as we use it in the infinite way and as these other metaphysical movements do. In other words, the day is coming when the brotherhood of man will be acknowledged by virtue of the fact that spiritual power, which no church can put a label on, no revelator can claim for a personal possession. Spiritual power will take the place of such names as Christian Science or Infinite Way. Spiritual power will be accepted as a power on earth in our human affairs. And that's all Mrs. Eddy ever hoped for, and that's all I ever hope for, is that the world will be governed by spiritual power. And I don't care whether you call it Buddha power, or Christ power. As a matter of fact, you can eliminate both of those and just call it spiritual power. And if you don't like the word spirit, fourth dimensional power. Yes, we can lift it into the realm of the universities and give them a name that they won't reject. Oh, they'll reject Christ. But they won't reject the fourth dimension because they're all looking for it. What a shock they'll have when they find it and see that its name is Christ. Do you see that the goal of all of this work is, number one, the recognition that there is a fourth dimension of life, and that life is governed by spiritual power. In that consciousness, there is no material law and there is no mental law. Material law and mental law exist only on the material and mental planes. But once you touch the fourth dimensional consciousness, you nullify material law. You nullify the germ law. You nullify infection and contagion. You even nullify bringing forth children in pain. And without narcotics. You nullify poverty. You nullify lack. You nullify hate, envy, jealousy, malice, in proportion as that fourth dimensional consciousness is experienced. For it is an impossibility to experience it and then ever after know anything about a Jew or a Gentile or a white or a black or an Oriental or an Occidental. It's an impossibility to fear infection or contagion or booms or depressions. It's an impossibility ever again to fear 99% of the things that the human race is fearing. It is impossible to fear death. Death will be overcome with the attainment of the fourth dimension. Not passing from this scene won't be overcome, because passing from this scene is as much a part of the natural spiritual life as developing from childhood to adulthood, from adulthood to maturity. But death will be unknown. Death will never be experienced. Death will never be feared, because it is the most natural thing in the world to see the spirit which I am transform itself from one form to another, progress from one place in consciousness to another, move out of a ghetto into the white-collar district, and out of the white-collar district and into the country, and out of the country into many countries. It is just a transitional experience in consciousness. It's a movement in consciousness from limitation to unlimitedness. It is a transition in consciousness from a life in the body to a life lived through the body, and a life that can move itself from one form of body to another form. Now, as human beings, we learn through our metaphysics, our correct letter of truth, certain truths which, when held to, when practiced, when thought upon, meditated upon, cogitated upon, gradually lift us higher and higher, lessens fears, lessens the personal sense of self, until each one has their Moses experience, or Elijah, or Elisha, or Jesus, or John, to where they too make this transition and realize, I'm not a body, I'm consciousness. There are not laws that act upon me, I am the law. There is not a way to travel, I am the way. There is not a truth to be known, I am the truth. There is no experience of resurrection, I am the resurrection. There is no immortal life to be attained, I am immortal life. There is a transition from one of those states to the higher one. This is the attainment of that fourth dimensional consciousness, in which then spiritual power supersedes both material and mental. That is demonstrated in our healing work. When you arrive at the place in healing work where you know right well there isn't any truth, and if it were, it wouldn't make any difference. The healing isn't going to take place whether you know it or don't know it. And this enables you to sit, listen, be still, until that flow begins. And then it performs the work. A student wrote me this week that someone called upon her for help, and she did nothing, and her friend had an instantaneous healing. And I wrote to her that I couldn't quite agree with her in her letter. I didn't think that she had evaluated the situation quite correctly, for I'm sure that if her friend had called the dry goods clerk down the street or the supermarket clerk down the street, and they had also done nothing, that she wouldn't have had a healing. No, I don't think that doing nothing is the answer. She had been studying for a good many years. She had been developing consciousness for a good many years. And when the call came, consciousness was ready to perform its work. That isn't doing nothing. My life doesn't signify that doing nothing gets you anyplace. You are doing something from the minute you awaken in the morning until you sleep at night. And it is what you are doing that determines the degree of consciousness that evolves. Yes, a call will come, and you are not consciously thinking certain thoughts, you are not consciously giving certain treatments, but you have attained a consciousness in which you are being still. The five physical senses are being still. That's doing something. That's quite an attainment, to arrive at that place where the five physical senses are still and the transcendental consciousness takes over and performs its work. And then you understand, He performeth that which is given me to do. He that is within me is greater than I, and greater than anything that's in the world. But all of this is attained. It's attained by our work. It's attained by our studies. It's attained by our practice of the specific principles that go to make up this work. Now you see, the message as it has evolved in these Tuesday mornings is in proportion to what you have drawn. Therefore, you have done something to bring forth the particular message that's come through. And it will be your responsibility as much as mine for whatever message comes through in our Tuesday nights. For no demonstration can rise higher than the consciousness from which it emanates. And that consciousness is going to be yours and mine. We are a united consciousness, studying together in this work, evolving together, and it is the degree of our united consciousness that will determine the depth of the message that comes through in our Tuesday nights. And so it is that we close our Tuesdays at Halekou on this note of the fourth dimension. And thank you until our Tuesday nights begin.